Let's talk about the ocean container. And they're everywhere, certainly here in Southern California. Honestly, you can't throw a rock without hitting an ocean container. And if you're not familiar with what a container is, it's basically in this photo on the right. They come in 20-foot lengths and 40-foot lengths and sometimes 45 and what are called high cubes and a bunch of different configurations. But the ocean container is just that. It's a metal container that cargo is placed in, put on cargo ships, and sent around the world. And actually, 90% of the world's commerce, international commerce, is conducted via ocean freight, the vast majority of which is done through containers. So that's what we're talking about here. So a brief history. The ocean container was a U.S. invention. A gentleman by the name of Malcolm McLean in North Carolina invented the ocean container in 1957. He actually owned a trucking company that dealt a lot with cargo ships that were moving cargo in bulk, which is to say everything that was loaded onto a ship, whether it was a carton or a giant crate, was done one piece at a time, what's referred to as bulk cargo. And he saw so many inefficiencies in that type of cargo handling that he came up with the idea for an ocean container. So very much a U.S. invention. And again, certainly the breadth and scope of international trade and the speed with which it's taken place since the end of World War II would not have been possible without the ocean container. So the ocean container, our second bullet point, drove globalization for several reasons. Number one, a dramatic reduction in shipping costs. The economies of scale between shipping goods loose in the hold of a vessel, in the hold of a ship, versus in containers is immeasurable. And given the volumes of containers that are millions and millions of containers around the world today, it just wouldn't be possible from both a handling and a cost perspective. Also save time. The handling of bulk. If you can imagine a ship having to be loaded piece by piece, carton by carton, crate by crate at origin and destination, there isn't enough time in the day, especially with the size of ships today. So there was a time element there. And also, it allowed for the construction of what's referred to as purpose-built ships and ports. So ships had to be either refitted, if they were existing ships, to accommodate containers, or the engineering designs of these ships had to change completely to accommodate these vessels, as well as the ports. And the first port, just as a brief aside, the first port in the United States that was purpose-built, meaning that port was designed and built exclusively for the use of containers, or specifically for the use of containers, was Newark in New Jersey. So when Malcolm McLean started with his invention of the ocean container, the actual first ship that carried containers went from Newark to Houston. It wasn't even an international move. It was a domestic move, carried 50-odd containers on it. You'll notice from our last bullet point that the largest ships in the world can now carry up to 20,000 containers, what are referred to as TEU, another acronym that we'll see moving forward quite frequently. That's a 20-foot equivalency unit, or our 20-foot container. So today's largest ships can handle 20,000 of these containers. Imagine what it would be like trying to move that much cargo loose, one piece at a time. It would be impossible. So if you think about the acceleration of global trade compared quantitatively to the first container ship with 53, 54 containers in, let's call it the early 1960s, and in 2015 a ship can handle 20,000 of those containers, it's just amazing to think how much the ocean container has contributed to the growth of trade. Wouldn't be possible without it. This is where the conversation really starts to take an air of supply chain management. And that has to do with the advent of outsourcing. Now, you hear this on the news and sometimes in the newspapers or business magazines, this whole idea of outsourcing and jobs being exported from the United States, and especially manufacturing jobs being lost. There's a lot of truth to that, but we're not here to discuss the perceived benefits or detriments of outsourcing. We're here to talk about its impact on supply chain management. So outsourcing, what is it, number one? It's a business practice whereby companies contract with third parties in other countries to provide any variety of services. So if I am a consumer electronics brand sold in retail stores across the United States and via e-commerce, it is very likely that although I design my products, maybe it's a tablet, maybe it's a smartphone, very likely that while I design that product, I don't manufacture it. I outsource that to a third party, what's referred to as a contract manufacturer. So you're adding a third party into an international transaction that, as we'll see in subsequent modules, can create a lot of complexity along the supply chain. But the biggest example of outsourcing is in the manufacturing side of things. And there are, it's hard to say quantitatively, but very few supply chains in the world today that don't have some element of outsourcing in it. Another example is information technology, cloud-based technology, where third-party software companies provide services to buyers and sellers of goods around the world. Could be from a hardware perspective or a software perspective or a combination of tools, but a lot of IT, as it's called, information technology services, are outsourced. The other example is logistics, the physical movement of goods being conducted by third parties. So whereas a large retailer in the United States owns stores and such, they may not own their own trucks or warehouses and distribution centers. They outsource that to what's called a 3PL, a third-party logistics company. And that, again, introduces another element into a supply chain, another player into the supply chain that has a potential for creating additional complexities. So that's really what outsourcing is, and typically seen in a manufacturing, IT, and logistics environment. The whole phenomenon, in our last bullet point on this slide, began in the late 80s and early 90s, and it's grown at a very fast rate ever since. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it's oftentimes criticized in the U.S. for exporting jobs. And while there is certainly an element of truth to that, the debate between the benefits and costs of outsourcing is a conversation for another day. Our reality is that outsourcing plays a major role today in global trade, and it was one of the main drivers of global trade historically. And outsourcing isn't going anywhere. So as we plan supply chains, as we understand how to execute on supply chain management, we have to understand what outsourcing is and who the players are. Moving on with our outsourcing conversation, a little bit of history here. Outsourced manufacturing definitely started in China, South China to be specific, Guangdong province, places like Shenzhen and Yantian and Guangzhou, but has expanded to other countries and regions, and that's in a very short period of time. We're talking about outsourcing really taking off in a period of 25 years. And although 25 years might sound like a long time, from a trade evolution perspective, it's not long at all. It is this decades-long process that created emerging economies like in Eastern Europe, where there's lots of outsourcing, Southeast Asia, we talked a little bit about, as well as Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, huge outsourcing activities going on in those countries across a variety of industries. Talked a little bit about IT services having been outsourced as well. Places like India and other English-speaking nations. One place you wouldn't think about IT services being outsourced to is Trinidad and Tobago, which was originally part of the British Empire and is very well known for its English-speaking skills as well as software development skills. So globalization is just that, global, and reaches the far corners of the earth. Last bullet point, and we'll get to this later as we see in our little smiley face, logistics services is also an area where outsourcing is very popular. We're going to introduce a term that you'll hear over and over again. I mentioned it a moment ago. It's 3PL, third-party logistics services, where trucking companies, warehousing companies, freight forwarders, customs brokers, fulfillment houses all offer services to actual buyers and sellers and manufacturers of goods on a third-party basis. Huge topic of global trade.